Hi, and welcome to TGCon Live and our session on how you can go from audit fatigue to audit hero. We're going to start momentarily, but first I have just a few housekeeping announcements. For the best viewing experience, we invite you to use theater mode. Just click on that box right below the main presentation screen. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is the chat box where you can type in any questions that you have. Our speakers are going to be monitoring the chat box and will be answering your questions in real time. Please also click over to the polls tab, which is next to chat, and you can answer our poll questions. Those poll questions may give you an idea of whether you're close to being an audit hero. If you do experience any audio or video issues, please click on the support tab. You're going to want to exit out of theater mode and go to the top of our main platform, and you'll see a support button in the upper right-hand corner. Click on support and then click on get help. Those folks are the ones that can help triage your problems. After the session, we would really appreciate if you would take the time to fill out our post-session survey using the link found below the presentation information. I know Joe and Mark and I would really be thrilled to have your input. Our speakers today are Corporate Compliance Manager for France, Mark Park, and TraceGains Account Executive, Joe Hodge. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen.
Thanks, Dana.
Thank you.
So I just want to start off by saying thank you for joining us for TGCon 2020 and being a great speaker.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's my privilege to talk to you today, and I apologize if I've had some unexpected things and events happen in the last 24 hours. As we all know, this whole thing is about auditing, and guess what? I got called to an audit unexpectedly, so it is affecting my time. So I apologize, but I'm happy to be here.
Perfect. Well, Mark, I'll go ahead and start passing things over to you.
All right. Well, I've been asked to speak to you today about supplier management and the impact it's had on our business and maybe some rules and requirements to remember. So the first thing I would like to discuss with you is, what is supplier management? How does supplier management make my company better? Does supplier management help in regulatory requirements? FSMA and my responsibilities, so how that ties back into how TraceGains can be utilized to help you meet those responsibilities, how it helps you with auditing, and customer success and support. So what is supplier management? Supplier management in the TraceGains system utilizes the paper that you have in your system and streamlines the data so you are able to be more familiar with what suppliers you have and your connection to them. So here below is an example of a connected supplier, a pending connection to a supplier, and no connection to a supplier. Now, we don't like it when they're gray, and we prefer when they're huddling. That's what I always call them when they're connected, that we're huddled together to perform a task together. And I think that that's a great way to remember it and know that that's a supplier that's going to be one of your best and provide you the most information. Here's an example of what it looks like on the screen. So when you're looking at your TraceGains screen, you can see that there's no connection here. Of course, these are test stuff, but here's some connections, full connections, and you can see the documentation is relatively good. Here's one where it's partially connected, and you can see that the documentation isn't as effective as you might like it to be. So that's a good indicator of how you can see how your connections are working and how your documentations are working that you need with your supplier. So how does supplier management make my company better? So the ability to communicate with your suppliers becomes more and more crucial during these new times of compliance. And I might add to this, with COVID and other things that are happening also in the world, there's a lot less one-on-one time or open time where we're together. Now everything's online. So this is really going to make a difference in your auditing programs and everything else. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Supplier management takes the guesswork out of your approved supplier list and what information that you are looking for. So documents stored in one location are readily available at your fingertips. It saves time and makes you more efficient at your job.
So Mark, just kind of right here, right? I was just kind of curious, some of the examples that maybe you may have had that TraceGains have helped with that, you know, if you didn't have TraceGains, that it might have been cumbersome. Do you have anything that you can maybe list out there?
You know, Joe, I have so many examples. I had an auditor get a hold of me yesterday. We were going through an audit. This was virtual audit, and we were able to identify some packaging information. They didn't like what we showed them because we showed them the spec, but we were able to show them all these documents on TraceGains to include a third-party audit, and that was what they were actually looking for. They just weren't calling it out. So it's also knowing what your auditor is requesting helps as well. But yeah, we were able to show that information and satisfy that auditor.
Perfect.
Here's an example of some of the different documents that you would have. And these are item level documents. So you're going to, or supplier level documents, you're going to have supplier level documents and you're going to have item level documents. Supplier level documents will be things like third-party audits. Item level documents will be things specific to the raw material. Does supplier management help in regulatory requirements? Yes, it does. And another example is the FDA has asked us for documentation. We've been able to share that with them. They've also asked us to give them some documentation at times, and we're able to share that information as we see fit or as needed. But the system allows you to prepare for questions that may come up during regulatory by using those system and you going out and looking at those documents so you're always ready. It also can help you identify your certificate of origin, it can also help you identify your country of origin, and how that would work is on your main screen. You can actually decide how you want to look at that, and it'll show you. So you just get with your customer service rep and they can help set your screen up that way so you can see what country of origin your raw materials are coming from. You can identify their risk assessment, the product specifications, the supplier questionnaires with a click of a button. And I might add, the more that your suppliers use the supplier questionnaires, the easier streamlining this becomes. Visibility and my responsibilities. So understanding your supply chain prevention is your responsibility. So FSPCA happens to be part of the Food Safety Preventive Control Alliance. I happen to be a trainer. So I took some slides out to just kind of go through those real quick and make sure you guys understand the supply chain responsibilities. Supply chain preventive controls for human foods. You need to identify hazards. For example, maybe you don't have a hazard. If you were having vinegar, there is not really a hazard because of the acidity level in the vinegar. So therefore, there wouldn't be a hazard identified. But you do need to look at your pathogens that could be coming in or anything else, microbiological, physical, or chemical that may be coming in. And then you have to figure out how you're going to control that either at your facility or prior to receiving into your facility. And that's something you have to work with either your supplier or as the receiving facility, or you have to let the customer know that's downstream from you. Supply chain programs are not required when no hazards exist. For example, the vinegar we talked about, or if you're not the one controlling the hazard. But you do need to make sure, again, that your customer is notified of that. Exclusions could be an importer or a food supply for research, as long as you're not selling it. Supply chain requirements could be things as you have to use approved suppliers. This is where TraceGains comes in to give you that approved supplier list at a click of a button, and those verification activities based off of risk are all built in, so you know exactly what verification activities you need to start conducting. Then you need to conduct those activities and then document those activities. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in the FSPCA rules because many of you have already taken this for human foods. So using approved suppliers, it applies to the hazards. So it depends on what you're trying to control, and those are the things you have to determine. And then you can get a temporary exception with justification. You need to have written procedures for receiving, and you need to have receiving records. Verification activities could be an on-site audit, could be sampling and testing. by the supplier or the receiving facility. So some suppliers don't want to do that. They don't want to build that into their cost. So as a receiving facility, you may have to build that into your cost. Review your supplier's food safety records for the ingredient or other if applicable. The people that can perform supplier verification, it just needs to be a qualified individual at the end of the day, and you want to make sure that that information is coming into your facility. On-site audit requirements, you need to have a documented on-site audit and at least annually or after the initial audit. Now this can be done in a couple different ways. It can be conducted by the supplier, an outside lab, or by the receiving facility. So if you're sampling and testing, you can have it done this way. You can communicate those results in a certificate of analysis. You can also use methods. The methods used must be fit for purpose, and that would be your lab needs to be certified to do that. And you need to consult references and appropriate tests for different types of products. Indicator tests must be made more useful than pathogen tests to assess effectiveness of overall controls. So for example, coliforms in dairy are going to give you a good microbiological level of where you want to be depending on the level of coliforms you want in your product. Actions taken if you have non-conformances, it's required for any kind of food safety plan to have actions in place when records or non-conformances are not being followed, or change in control processes. So if you change suppliers or something along purchasing changes the supplier, the verification records are wrong, all of those things would require a reanalysis of the food safety plan. On-site audit documentation. So if you are going to go out and conduct on-site audits, you need to include things like supplier name and location, audit procedures, audit dates, audit conclusions, corrective actions, and documentation that the audit was conducted by a qualified auditor. And a qualified auditor can be determined by looking into the human foods and taking that class. So sampling and testing documentation, you must include identification of the raw material and the test being conducted, the date the test was done, the results, the corrective actions, and the lab conducting the test. So when you go through, you can also utilize a third-party auditor, which would allow you to also utilize GFSI standards, which can all be put in TraceGains. So as you see, all this information that you're asking for can utilize a couple different systems in TraceGains. I'll just throw them out there. Supplier Management's one, Supplier Compliance would be the other, using certificate of analysis and things like that. We're not really going to go into any details, but it's a good module that will help you and better you as you conduct all of these different items that you need to conduct. Auditing. Auditing for any and all audits becomes faster and easier. So did you know you can allow your customers or retailers to quickly identify that you are following regulations with a click of a button? TraceGains is allowing customers to get the information they need for the regulatory requirements without the necessity of a site visit. So I have a retailer that I'm able to communicate with, give them audit information, product specification information, anything that they really want, I'm able to upload into TraceGains and provide that through the cloud into TraceGains and into their folder. And then they're able to review that. Sometimes they don't always want what you send, but at least it's a little faster than doing things by fax or by email or whatever you've done in the past.
Now, Mark, I noticed that you mentioned a lot about, supplier management being faster, it's easier. But can you share some stories, maybe some different examples of maybe you being on the road and you needed access to the information? I know you travel a lot. I know I travel a lot, so I'm sure having access to the information at the, just at our fingertips is pretty important.
Absolutely, Joe. So there's been several times where I've been on the road and a customer has been requesting some documentation, and someone in the staff couldn't find it, or maybe we just needed to add that documentation, or we had to create the documentation. And I was able to do that, or find it, upload it, get it out there on TraceGains, and then share that with my customer within a couple of hours or less. Just depends on if I have to create something or not. But the fact that I could go out and do that in such a timely manner with really little effort. Occasionally, it's going to take more time, obviously, if you have to create something, but typically it's just a matter of who's got the file and how we're going to go about it. So it's, yeah, that's a great question, Jim. Customer success and support. So the only thing I can say about TraceGains is about the customer success and support, and it's second to none. They have the ability to work with others. They're willing to listen. They continually make modifications and work on additional information that we need in the industry. They do this with a customer success representative from TraceGains. They use a group of skilled computer geeks, and I call them geeks because that's really what they are. Have you ever partied with them? You would know what I'm talking about. And they give us improvements that make the site easier to use and manipulate for our needs. And when I talk about geeks, yes, I am talking about AJ. The ability to participate in work groups to continue to improve in the TraceGains system. You know, we have plenty of work groups that are happening in TraceGains. I happen to be able to work in one of them myself, and it's a privilege of mine because I get my voice heard. I get to listen to what other challenges companies are having through the conferences and different things, and then I can bring those up and we can talk about it as a group so we can better the system, because it's not just TraceGains. We're a family that's creating this great system that's going to revolutionize the world in documentation. Now, sometimes and occasionally the request is more than the system can currently manage or the geeks have figured out yet, but your voice is still heard.
All right, so as Mark has mentioned, right, that we're experiencing more audits. We're not experiencing fewer, as all of you are probably pretty well aware, ranging from things like GFSI, FSMA, third-party, customer audits, right? The list goes on with what types of audits we're all experiencing, and they're not going away, right? And it's probably pretty hard to, continuously deal with these audits, especially when you're dealing with things in filing folders or filing cabinets, shared drives, or things like subfolders under subfolders. And every one of your customers are demanding that you have every document for every supplier and every product at every facility. Right, and so this is probably something that everybody's pretty familiar with. We all have done this in our time in food and beverage. I'm sure everybody's used to calling their suppliers, asking for documentation, or getting emails from their suppliers, trying to figure out where the documentation is at, or maybe you're sending out emails to remind them where they're at within their documentation requirements. And then you're doing things like risk assessment, potentially doing that same thing for notifications for suppliers, where you're trying to manage which supplier owes you what document by what date through a Microsoft Excel-based program, or you could be using an outdated system that's more of like a single-based portal type of solution. Now, our customers, there's a few different reasons why they come to TraceGains. And it's not only just because we help them maintain 24/7 audit readiness, but it's also that they're gaining a lot of efficiencies, as Mark kind of alluded to during his presentation there, but as well as a lot of our customers are telling us, is that it's not only just about them creating a lot of efficiencies for their side, but it's also about creating a lot of efficiencies on the supplier end, like things like post-once technology. What I've always told a lot of my customers is that a supplier management platform is only as good as the adoption rate of those suppliers. And in today's world, especially when audits are unannounced, or you have third-party audits or customer audits that are happening, you need to make sure you have all your documentation in order. And doing this in a very old school or old-fashioned way of email, phone calls, and so forth just won't cut it, right? And you have to make it to where it's efficient for suppliers to get that documentation over to you. And that's what TraceGains is really about. It's not only just the customer-facing end for efficiency, but that's also on the suppliers-facing end. So with TraceGains, we know that our customers can sleep easy at night knowing that they're maintaining a 24/7 audit-ready platform because they do have a software provider like TraceGains, who is not only just a software provider, but also a partner within their supplier management processes. Now, a lot of them have also told us that this is just an easier way just to be able to easily organize, manage supplier and item level documents. But then also, I've even had a few different customers that mentioned to me that, you know, there's times to where their audit prep would take anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 days. So maybe not to that extent, and then down to mere hours, to where it's 2, 3, or 4 hours of actually prepping for an audit, which is huge for any company. And so a lot of you out there today that you know, may not know who TraceGains is, or maybe you're not a customer of TraceGains yet, and you're coming to TraceGains conference to kind of figure out kind of what the hype is about. What is it that TraceGains is doing so different than any other company is doing? And what I will tell you is that it really comes down to a network effect. So with TraceGains, you can just imagine it in this way, to where I'm sure everybody out there is using something similar to like a LinkedIn of the world, right? To where it's a network effect. You're connecting with coworkers, colleagues, peers, friends, family, and so forth. And the moment that you connect with them, you start seeing their information in real time, right? So it's the same type of concept here at TraceGains, to where your suppliers would be joining this network. You would be connecting with them, just like that friends request that Mark showed earlier in this presentation. And as that friends request happened, the documentation that your suppliers are submitting underneath of their profile on the TraceGains network is then sent to your TraceGains instance in real time, right? So there's no more emailing suppliers. There's no more phone calls to these suppliers asking where this documentation's at. It's automatically being driven into your TraceGains platform, to where everything is organized, tracked, trended, compared, it's time and date stamped. You have a full audit trail to information. You even have things like supplier scorecarding and risk assessment happening on demand. Now, how is risk assessment and scorecarding happening on demand? Well, that's just another powerful feature with TraceGains and our network, and that's the power of this network effect, is being able to have TraceGains power on, bring in that supplier documentation, extract the data from that supplier documentation, and bring it into your TraceGains instance again, where everything's organized, you have that full audit trail, and that risk assessment can happen really and literally at a click of a button. So this is an example of a supplier who is going to be utilizing the TraceGains network. Now, beforehand, what the supplier was utilizing was the old school way, right? Being able to send things through email, or having to have calls with their customers. Maybe they're sending things through fax and so forth. And so this supplier, as you can see here on the screen, has multiple different customers that they need to send out documentation to. Now, you can imagine that this supplier has, you know, not only an allergen form, but they also have a kosher, a halal, a GMO, a country of origin, right? The list goes on with what type of documentation is that you need to be collecting from your suppliers. But that's all for one said specific item. Now think about the hundreds of different items that not only that supplier has to deal with and the documentation backed behind that, but then also what his customer and you yourself also has to deal with and collect in a proactive manner rather than that reactive type of approach. So what would happen here is that Supplier X, as he starts joining the TraceGains platform, he's going to create his profile. It's a free profile, right? As I mentioned, it's something pretty similar to the LinkedIns of the world out there today, that network effect, creating a free profile, uploading your information. And so as the supplier uploads his information, the connection request is going to happen between one customer. We'll just take for an example here. We'll say T. Marzetti there, and then the John R. White company. These two companies here are a customer of Supplier X. They're connecting with Supplier X, but this supplier also has other customers that are part of the TraceGains network. So the moment that all of these connections happen, this information is now distributed out to not only the John R. White company and T. Marzetti, but also all of the other customers that the supplier has that is also part of the TraceGains platform. So I'm sure you all can imagine and see why this is, number one, so successful, not only for our customers, but also for the supplier facing end as well. And last but not least, since I've been hitting a lot about this network and how powerful it is, this network has been growing, right? It's been growing year over year. There's over 30,000 plus different supplier locations out there today on our network. It's in over 100 plus different countries. There's over 250,000 plus different raw materials, items, and ingredients that all have regulatory documentation backed behind each individual item and ingredient down to that specific location level. So as you're going out there sourcing for new suppliers, usually back in the day, right? I don't know if everybody else is remembering this or not, but we used to go to conferences and trade shows, and now what you have the ability to do so with TraceGains, instead of exchanging business business cards, is being able to go out there on the network, find that type of raw material, find that type of item, look into the regulatory documentation backed behind that supplier, request a sample, and really expedite that supplier approval process. And with that, I believe we're going to go ahead and start fielding some questions. I'll pass things over to the moderator.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a fantastic presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. I'd like to invite everyone to click down below this presentation and click on the survey. We'd love to have your feedback. I know Mark and Joe and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's session. That does it for now. Please enjoy the rest of your TGCon Live experience.